Hey everyone, I wanted to create a welcome video where I just kind of welcome you to our class, talk about some of the books for class and how class is set up. So English 1B is an introduction to literature class, and it's always loads of fun. Basically, you have to look over, you basically read a novel, you look at some poetry, and we'll look at two plays. In fact, our class is going to look at two novels. One is a book, and then the other is a graphic novel, right? And you'll notice in the first week of class, in week one, I tried to keep it pretty simple, but you're going to look at the set of poems. I think there's something like 15 poems. And these are the poems that are the foundation of class. So we'll immediately jump into some of the poetry. Now, the first novel you're going to look at, and you'll notice it's a novel above my head. That is a book by Anita Shreve, and it's called A Change in Altitude. And I've taught Anita Shreve. I've taught four of her books, and I got to tell you, I really, really like Anita Shreve. And she's a really interesting figure because she's a contemporary author. She died pretty recently. I think she dies in 2018. And she's really started to seep into the canon of literature. So I think there's a lot of, kind of sometimes there's an argument about who are some of the great writers of American literature today. And so notice above me, there are some pictures and some novels of some of the great contemporary authors of our time. And the first one is John Updike. And Updike, who's an author that we'll read one of his short stories, he is considered to be one of the great writers of the last half of the 20th century. And really famous for his book on the Rabbit series. So there's a book called Rabbit Run. And Updike has basically won every single major award for literature. He basically, people basically argue he was going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and then he passed away. The other author, one of the great contemporary authors of our time is Toni Morrison, and she's above my head as well. Notice Toni Morrison's one of the great African-American women writers of literature. She is fabulous. She won the Nobel Prize for her novel, Beloved. But we're going to look at Anita Shreve, and we're going to look at her book called A Change in Altitude. And basically, our class is going to determine really whether Shreve should be considered one of the great writers of American literature. And does she belong there up with with authors such as Updike or Toni Morrison? Change in Altitude is really kind of interesting because what it deals with is a group of expats that live in Kenya. And basically, they decide that they're going to climb Mount Kenya. And as they're preparing to count for Mount Kenya, a really strange events start to unfold. There's an accident. There's kind of this mystery. And I actually got to tell you, I really, really liked A Change in Altitude. So I'll be curious to see what you think about this. But it's also going to kind of push us outside of our comfort zone because we're going to look at literature that deals and examines Africa to some extent. So we'll bring in some of the great African writers of literature, Chinua Achebe. But it's I found it to be a really, really enjoyed this book. So that's the first book that I'm excited for. Notice in the middle of our cover, we're looking at a graphic novel. And you could argue that I'm a terrible teacher because we're looking at a comic book, but we're looking at a book called The Harlem Hellfighters. And it's a book that deals with the first and only African regiment that fought during World War I. And this was a time when Jim Crow was the law of the land. And here it is, you have a group of African-American soldiers who fought in World War I. And their story is so epic and so heroic, and they fought so bravely, yet they weren't allowed to fight for the United States. They actually had to fight with the French. But with this novel, it's interesting about the Harlem Hellfighters is that it's only a graphic novel that gives them credit for their contributions during the First World War. What I found in the past is that students really like this. They like being exposed to part of a history that they didn't know. They like looking at a graphic novel. It opens up the door for us to look at World War I literature, as well as writers such as like Langston Hughes. So that's the second book we'll look at. Then I noticed in the far right corner is backpackers literature. That's the novel that we'll have. It's the textbook that'll have all the short stories, some of the poems that we're going to look at, and some of the plays that we're going to look at. But I'm super excited. I think this class is going to be lots of fun. English 1B is always lots of fun. So notice with our class, how it's set up is that we're never going to meet on person. We're only going to meet online. And I've set up so that students have a full week to work on classwork and course assignments. But for our class specifically, everything is due by Friday at midnight. And I like so students have that flexibility. They can balance their time. The only thing that they need to do is just make sure you check in on Monday. You know what work is due, and then everything is due by Friday at midnight. So I'm really excited for our class. It's going to be lots of fun. I'll look forward to seeing what you think of the poems that are the foundation of class, and then we'll go from there.